Dawn breaks over a rugged frontier town. A gruff, solitary man sweeps the porch of a weathered saloon, his movements mechanical, eyes distant with grief. Inside, two identical 11-year-old girls with copper braids set tables in perfect unison, moving with the practiced rhythm of those who've known only one home. A lone rider in a cavalry uniform appears on the horizon, clutching a worn photograph and a letter sealed with wax. His eyes search the town with purpose. Title appears, Blood and Bourbon. The man on horseback whispers, "After all these years, I've found them." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Garrett Sullivan moved with unhurried precision through the darkened interior of the Frontier Star Saloon. Dawn had barely broken over Timber Creek, but he'd been awake for hours already, same as every day for the past 5 years. Sleep was a luxury that rarely visited him for more than a few restless hours at a time. At 45, Garrett's once black hair had surrendered to silver at the temples, and deep lines framed eyes that had forgotten how to smile. His movements were deliberate, economical. A man who'd learned that wasted motion, like wasted words, served no purpose in a world that took far more than it gave. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots as he moved behind the long mahogany. A bar, his fingertips skimming the polished surface by habit. The Frontier Star had once been the pride of Timber Creek, a place where cattlemen and railroad workers alike could find good whiskey, honest card games, and Abigail Sullivan's famous venison stew. But Abigail was gone now. 5 years buried on the hill overlooking town, alongside their unborn child. Garrett hadn't had the heart to change a thing about the saloon since the day the fever took her. The recipes remained pinned to the kitchen wall in her flowing handwriting. Her piano gathered dust in the corner, unplayed save for when traveling. Musicians passed through. Garrett struck a match, the brief flare illuminating the stern planes of his face as he lit the oil lamps. One by one, the shadows retreated to the corners as warm light filled the room. He paused at the last lamp, his gaze falling on the staircase leading to the rooms above. Specifically, the third door on the right. They'd be awake soon. They always rose with the sun, those two, as if afraid they might miss something important if they lingered too long in dreams. He hadn't planned on becoming responsible for anyone ever again after Abigail. Yet here he was, 5 years later, with 2 11-year-old girls, depending on him for everything. Life had a way of mocking a man's plans. The coffee began to percolate on the stove as Garrett sorted through yesterday's earnings. Business was steady, if not booming. Timber Creek had grown in recent years as the railway expanded westward, bringing a constant stream of workers, travelers, and the occasional trouble that followed both. The town had doubled in size, with a proper schoolhouse, a church, and even talk of a telegraph office coming by year's end. Mr. Sullivan, he turned to find the twins standing at the foot of the stairs, already dressed in their simple calico dresses, copper hair neatly braided. Despite being identical in appearance, Emma and Charlotte Sullivan, they'd taken his name years ago, though no papers had ever made it official, had long since developed their own distinct ways. Emma, the first to speak each morning, stood, slightly ahead, her posture straight as a cavalry officer's. Charlotte hung back half a step, quieter, but watching everything with eyes that missed nothing. "Girls," he acknowledged with a nod. "Coffee's almost ready. Biscuits from yesterday are in the tin." Emma nodded, already moving toward the kitchen with purpose. Charlotte lingered, studying Garrett's face in that unsettling way she had, as if taking inventory of his thoughts. "It's the anniversary," she said simply, not a question. Garrett's hands stilled on the ledger. The girls had an uncanny memory for dates. Never forgot a birthday, a death day, or the exact date they'd arrived in Timber Creek, half-starved and silent in the back of a bullet-riddled wagon. "Yes," he said finally. Charlotte nodded once, accepting his sparse response without complaint, then followed her sister to the kitchen. The twins had learned early that Garrett Sullivan wasn't one for excessive talking, especially about the past. They'd adapted to his ways just as he'd adapted to theirs. The routine was well established. After 5 years, the girls would help prepare the saloon for the day, sweeping floors, wiping tables, polishing glasses, before heading off to school at 8:30 sharp. They'd return by 4, help with the early dinner crowd, then retreat upstairs for schoolwork until bed. The system worked. It gave them structure, kept them busy, and most importantly, kept them safe. Garrett sipped his black coffee, listening to the familiar sounds of Emma directing her sister on proper table arrangement. Those girls could probably run the place without him, he reflected. They'd learned every aspect of the business, from spotting watered-down whiskey to calculating change faster than men twice their age. They weren't his by blood, weren't even his by law, but something fiercer than legal documents or shared ancestry had formed between them over the years. Something born of shared tragedy and hard-won trust. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Garrett's attention to the front window. Sheriff Wade Mason dismounted from his dappled gray, hitching it to the post outside. A frown creased Garrett's brow. The sheriff rarely made social calls, especially not before official business hours. "Morning, Sullivan," Mason said as he entered, removing his hat. At 38, the sheriff carried himself with the easy confidence of a man comfortable with both his authority and its limitations. "Got coffee to spare?" Garrett gestured toward the pot without comment, waiting for the real purpose of this visit to emerge. Mason helped himself, then settled onto a bar stool, turning the cup in his hands before speaking. "Army's coming through," he said finally. "Full company by the sounds of it. Dispatch rider came ahead last night. They'll be here by sundown." Garrett absorbed this information silently. Army passing through wasn't uncommon. Timber Creek sat on the main route between Fort Laramie and Points West. But a full company meant preparations, supplies, and inevitable trouble when soldiers with back pay burned holes in their pockets. "They staying long?" "Day or two, from what I gather. Captain Thornton's leading them." "Name mean anything to you?" Garrett shook his head. Military officers came and went like seasons. Mason took a long sip of coffee. "He's been asking questions at every settlement between here and Kansas City. Something about a wagon train massacre 5 years back." Garrett's expression didn't change, but his hand tightened imperceptibly on his cup. In the kitchen, the soft chatter of the twins continued, unaware. "Lot of trouble on the trails back then," Garrett said evenly. "Indians, outlaws, weather." "Sure was," Mason agreed, watching Garrett carefully. "This one stood out, though. Entire party was wiped out except for 2 young children, twin girls." The silence that followed stretched taut as piano wire. In the distance, a train whistle sounded, the morning express right on schedule. "Something else on your mind, Sheriff?" Garrett finally asked. Mason set his cup down. "Look, Sullivan, we've known each other a long time. I was here when you found those girls, helped you get set up with them. Never asked too many questions because, frankly, you've done right by them. Town respects that. But Captain Thornton isn't just leading a company west. Word is he's the uncle of 2 girls who went missing after their parents' wagon was attacked near the Kansas border. Been searching for them ever since. Got himself assigned to Western postings specifically to keep looking." Garrett's face remained impassive. "Dedicated man." "Indeed." Mason finished his coffee and stood. "Just thought you should know. Might want to prepare the girls, if they're who he's looking for." He let the sentence hang unfinished. "Appreciate the warning," Garrett said, his voice betraying nothing of the storm brewing inside him. "We'll manage." Mason placed his hat back on his head. "Always do, don't you?" He paused at the door. "Sullivan, no matter what happens, this town stands with you. Remember that." As the door closed behind the sheriff, Emma and Charlotte emerged from the kitchen, carrying plates of sliced bread and preserves. "Was that Sheriff Mason?" Emma asked, setting her plate down with precision. Yes, Garrett replied simply. Is something wrong? Charlotte's perceptive gaze fixed on his face. Garrett looked at them both. These girls who had arrived in his life, like a thunderclap, on the very day he'd decided it might be better to end his own. These children who had somehow pulled him back from a grief so consuming he could barely breathe through it. These two souls who had, without saying a word, given him reason to wake each morning. No, he lied, for the first time in all their years together, nothing's wrong. The girls exchanged a glance, that silent communication that still unnerved him sometimes, but didn't press further. They continued with their morning duties, unaware that by nightfall, everything might change. Garrett watched them work, his mind racing through possibilities, contingencies, preparations. He'd grown up an orphan himself, knew the system's cruelties intimately, had weathered years of being passed from family to family before escaping west at 16. He'd sworn no child in his care would ever face that fate, but blood was blood. And the law had clear ideas about where orphaned children belonged, with family, if any could be found. Outside, Timber Creek continued waking to the new day. The general store's bell jingled as its doors opened. The blacksmith's hammer began, its rhythmic pounding. A wagon laden with fresh timber creaked down the main street. It was just another ordinary morning in a small frontier town, except for the cloud of dust on the horizon, still too distant to see, but coming closer with every passing hour, bringing with it a man who could tear apart the careful life Garrett Sullivan had built. Above the bar hung a rifle that hadn't left its hooks in years. Garrett's eyes drifted to it, then away. He hoped it wouldn't come to that. But if it did, he looked again at the twins, now carefully arranging fresh wildflowers in tin cans on each table. Charlotte's touch. Emma would have considered it impractical, but she indulged her sister's small attempts at beauty. If it came to choosing between the law and those girls, Garrett knew exactly where he stood. Some bonds, once formed, couldn't be broken. Not by blood, not by law, not by armies. The clock on the wall ticked steadily forward, counting down the hours until sundown, until the dust on the horizon became men on horseback, until the past, like an unpaid debt, finally came due. 5 years earlier, the wagon's broken wheel jutted awkwardly into the air like a snapped bone. Smoke still curled from the canvas cover, now riddled with bullet holes. The scene was a testament to violence, swift, merciless and thorough. Garrett Sullivan hadn't planned on taking the South Trail back to Timber Creek. The northern route was more direct from Fort Laramie, but something about the gathering storm. Clouds had pushed him to the longer path. Now, as he surveyed the aftermath of what could only be described as a massacre, he wondered if some cruel force had guided him here deliberately. 7 bodies. He'd counted twice. All adults, arranged, in the careless sprawl of sudden death. 2 women, 5 men. No obvious survivors. Garrett had seen death before, had dealt it himself during the war, had watched it claim Abigail with agonizing slowness just 8 months prior, but this display of calculated brutality made his stomach turn. These weren't casualties of nature or disease. These were murders, plain and simple. Bandits, most likely. The area had seen an uptick in attacks on isolated travelers. Desperate men made more desperate by drought and dwindling opportunities. They'd have taken anything of value, money, jewelry, weapons, supplies. The wagon had been thoroughly ransacked, its contents scattered like fallen leaves. Garrett knelt beside the nearest body, a man in his 30s, well-dressed despite the trail dust, with a neat beard and a wedding band still on his finger. No use removing jewelry from the dead. The living had more pressing needs. "I'm sorry," Garrett murmured, though he wasn't sure why. The dead man couldn't hear him, and Garrett hadn't failed him. He'd never even known him, yet the familiar weight of guilt settled across his shoulders as he closed the man's staring eyes. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The storm would reach him within the hour. Garrett should move on, make camp before the downpour. These poor souls were beyond help, and lingering wouldn't serve any purpose except to dampen his already dark mood. He'd report the attack when he reached Timber Creek. Perhaps Sheriff Mason could send a telegram to Fort Laramie. Let the army deal with proper burials and notifications of next of kin. Garrett had his own grief to manage. He couldn't shoulder the weight of strangers' tragedies, too. He was halfway back to his horse when he heard it. So faint, he almost believed he'd imagined it. A whimper, small, frightened, human. Garrett froze, senses suddenly alert. He'd been a tracker during the war, had developed an ear for sounds that didn't belong. And that sound, that tiny, terrified sound, definitely didn't belong among the dead. Slowly, deliberately, he moved toward the source. The rear of the wagon, where the canvas cover had partially collapsed, creating a small cavity between wooden slats and singed fabric. He crouched, pulling the material aside. Two identical faces stared back at him, eyes wide with terror. Girls, young, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, huddled together so tightly they might have been a single person, with 2 heads, identical copper-colored hair in disheveled braids, matching blue dresses, now smudged with dirt and something darker that Garrett didn't want to identify. For a moment, Garrett simply stared, as stunned by their presence as they were by his. Children, survivors, witnesses to unimaginable horror. "Hello," he said finally, his voice rough from disuse. He'd hardly spoken to anyone during his 2-week trading journey. "I won't hurt you." The girls didn't respond. Their eyes, an unusual shade between green and grey, watched him with the wariness of cornered animals. "Are you injured?" Garrett asked, scanning what he could see of them for blood or obvious wounds. "Can you understand me?" Still no response. Just that unblinking, synchronized stare. Rain began to fall, fat droplets that quickly gained momentum, drumming against the broken wagon and the bodies cooling around them. Within minutes, it would become a deluge. Garrett made a swift decision. "I'm going to help you out of there. We need shelter." He reached slowly toward them, telegraphing his movements. The girl on the left flinched away. The one on the right grabbed her sister's hand tighter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I understand you're scared," Garrett said, keeping his voice low and even, "but that storm's coming fast, and we can't stay here. There's a line shack about 2 miles east. Dry. Safe." He wasn't sure they comprehended his words, but the increasing rain seemed to convince them of the situation's urgency. The slightly braver of the two extended a trembling hand. Garrett took it gently, helping her emerge from the hiding place. Her sister followed, still attached like a shadow. Standing before him, they were painfully small. Thin limbs, prominent. Collarbones visible at the necklines of their dresses. How long had they been hiding? Hours? A day? "My name is Garrett Sullivan," he told them, though he wasn't sure why he bothered with introductions. They weren't speaking. Might not ever speak again after what they'd witnessed. "I'll take you somewhere safe, then we'll figure out what comes next." He led them to his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Scout, who stood patiently in the increasing rain. The girls hesitated at the animal's size. "He's gentle," Garrett assured them, patting Scout's neck. "I'll lift you up, one at a time." To his surprise, the bolder twin shook her head firmly. She pointed to her sister, then to herself, then clasped. Their hands together, message clear. They wouldn't be separated, not even for the brief moment it would take to mount the horse. "All right," Garrett conceded. "Together, then." It took some maneuvering, but he managed to get both girls onto Scout's, back simultaneously. He mounted behind them, reaching around their small bodies to grasp the reins. They were rigid against him, but at least they didn't pull away. As they rode from the scene of slaughter, rain washing away tracks and blood alike, Garrett felt the enormity of what had just happened. 8 months of isolating himself, of pushing, Away every connection, refusing Sheriff Mason's invitations to dinner and rebuffing Mrs. Peterson's attempts to draw him out with baked goods and sympathy. 8 months of existing rather than living. And now, through some cosmic joke, he was responsible for not 1, but 2 traumatized children. The line shack appeared through the curtain of rain just as dusk began to settle. It was a simple structure. 1 room, dirt floor, a small iron stove and bunks built into the wall. Used primarily by cowboys during cattle drives, it was rudimentary, but sound. Garrett dismounted, lifting the girls down in a single motion. They remained silent as he led Scout to the lean-to shelter attached to the shack, quickly unsaddling him and providing water from a barrel collected rainwater. Inside, the shack smelled of dust and old coffee. Garrett moved efficiently, lighting the stove with kindling and matches from his saddlebags, spreading his bedroll on one of the bunks, heating water in a small pot. The twins stood just inside the door, still holding hands, watching his every move with that unsettling, unified stare. "You must be hungry," Garrett said, rummaging through his supplies. He found jerky, hardtack, and a small sack of dried apples. Not ideal for children, but better than nothing. "Come sit by the stove. Get warm." To his mild surprise, they obeyed, moving to the rough-hewn bench near the stove. They sat with spines straight, shoulders touching, knees pressed together, like parts of the same organism. Garrett placed a tin plate before them with equal portions of food. "Eat slowly," he advised. "Small bites." They looked at the food, then at him, then at each other. Some silent communication passed between them before they each took a piece of jerky and began to chew cautiously. As they ate, Garrett took stock of their condition more thoroughly. No visible injuries, though dirt and ash streaked their faces and clothes. Their dresses were of good quality, not frontier homespun, but finer material, with careful stitching and delicate lace at the collars. Their boots were well-made leather. Whoever their family had been, they hadn't lacked for money, which raised questions about their journey. Most families heading west took the main trails, traveled in larger groups for protection. The attacked wagon had been alone, off the established routes, running from something or towards something specific. "Do you have names?" Garrett asked. After they'd eaten half the food, the girls exchanged another look. Then, to his astonishment, the one on the right spoke. Her voice was small but clear. "I'm Charlotte." Her sister followed immediately. "I'm Emma." Garrett nodded, careful not to show too much reaction and possibly silence them again. "Charlotte and Emma, good names, strong names." "Our mama chose them," Emma continued, seeming to gain confidence. "From a book." "Is she—" Charlotte began, then faltered, looking toward the door as if her mother might walk through it. Garrett's chest tightened. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "No use in lying to them. No use in elaborate explanations of death." Children understood more than adults gave them credit for. Tears welled in Charlotte's eyes, but she didn't cry. Emma's face hardened slightly, her jaw setting in a way that seemed far too adult for her years. "Everyone?" Emma asked. "The single word containing volumes," Garrett nodded. "Yes. Uncle James, too." Charlotte's voice wavered. "I don't know names," Garrett admitted. "Just that no one else survived." The girls absorbed this information with eerie composure. No hysterics, no wailing. Just a deepening of that stillness that had surrounded them from the moment he'd found them. "We were going to St. Louis," Emma volunteered after a long silence, "to live with our father's sister." "After Mama and Papa died," Charlotte added softly. Garrett frowned. "Your parents were already deceased?" Emma shook her head. "They died in the sickness. Uncle James was taking us to Aunt Margaret." Understanding dawned. The man with the neat beard, Uncle James presumably, had been transporting his orphaned nieces to another relative. a journey of mercy that had ended in tragedy. This, Aunt Margaret, Garrett said carefully. Do you know where in St. Louis she lives? Her full name? The twins looked at each other again, that silent conference that was becoming familiar. Finally, Charlotte answered. Aunt Margaret Thornton. She lives in a yellow house near a church. She paused. That's all we know. Not much to go on. St. Louis was a large city with dozens of churches, and tracking down one Margaret Thornton without an address would be nearly impossible. Rain pounded the roof of the line shack, emphasizing the isolation of their situation. Timber Creek was still a day's ride away. Once there, Garrett would have to decide what to do with these children. The logical solution would be to place them with a family in town until permanent arrangements could be made. The Petersons had several children already, but they were good people. Or perhaps the widow, Jenkins, who'd lost her own daughter to diphtheria last winter. Garrett pushed these thoughts aside. One problem at a time. First get the girls safely to town, then figure out the rest. It's time to rest, he told them. You can have the bunk. I'll sleep on the floor. To his surprise, Emma shook her head firmly. We won't take your bed, sir. Mr. Sullivan, Charlotte corrected her sister gently. Mr. Sullivan, Emma amended. We can sleep on the floor. We're used to hard ground from the wagon. Garrett studied them, these two small, dignified creatures with their identical faces and their different ways of facing tragedy. One slightly harder, one slightly softer, but both remarkably composed for children who'd lost everything twice over. No child sleeps on the floor while I have a bed, he said firmly. That's final. Reluctantly, the twins allowed him to settle them on the narrow bunk. He covered them with his spare blanket, then moved to the opposite side of the shack, spreading his slicker on the packed earth floor. He wasn't concerned about comfort. He'd slept on worse during the war. As the storm raged outside, Garrett stared at the rough-hewn ceiling, listening to the girls breathing gradually slow into sleep. He thought of Abigail, of the child they'd almost had, of the future that had died with them. He thought of his empty saloon with its dusty piano and quiet rooms. He thought of St. Louis and Margaret Thornton and her yellow house by some nameless church. Dawn brought clearing skies and difficult decisions. The twins woke simultaneously, sitting up in perfect synchronization like mechanical dolls. They accepted the simple breakfast Garrett provided without complaint, then helped pack his supplies without being asked. What happens now? Emma asked as Garrett saddled Scout. We ride to Timber Creek, he answered. It's a small town, but decent, has a doctor who can check you over. And then, Charlotte's eyes, he noticed, were slightly greener than her sister's. Garrett hesitated. Then, we will try to find your aunt, Margaret. The girls nodded solemnly. They didn't ask how that would happen, didn't demand promises or reassurances. They simply accepted his word as truth. That trust, unearned and unexpected, settled on Garrett's shoulders like a physical weight. The ride to Timber Creek was largely silent. The twins sat before him on Scout, occasionally pointing out birds or asking the names of plants they passed. Normal, childish curiosity surfacing through the layers of trauma. Garrett answered each question patiently, finding himself remembering botanical knowledge his father had taught him decades ago. They reached town mid-afternoon. Garrett hadn't been back since Abigail's funeral, had avoided the pitying looks and well-meaning condolences by conducting his business solely at Fort Laramie and other trading posts. Now, riding down Main Street with two identical girls perched. Before him, he felt eyes tracking their progress with undisguised curiosity. And then, Charlotte's eyes, he noticed, were slightly greener than her sister's. Garrett hesitated. Then we will try to find your Aunt Margaret. The girls nodded solemnly. They didn't ask how that would happen, didn't demand promises or reassurances. They simply accepted his word as truth. The trust, unearned and unexpected, settled on Garrett's shoulders like a physical weight. The ride to Timber Creek was largely silent. The twins sat before him on scout, occasionally pointing out birds or asking the names of plants they passed. Normal childish curiosity surfacing through the layers of trauma. Garrett answered each question patiently, finding himself remembering. Botanical knowledge his father had taught him decades ago. They reached town mid-afternoon. Garrett hadn't been back since Abigail's funeral, had avoided the pitying looks and well-meaning condolences by conducting his business solely at Fort Laramie and other trading posts. Now, riding down Main Street with two identical girls perched before him, he felt eyes tracking their progress with undisguised curiosity. Sheriff Mason was the first to approach as Garrett halted outside the doctor's house. "Sullivan," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon." His gaze shifted to the twins. "And with company." "Found them yesterday," Garrett explained briefly. "Wagon attack. They're the only survivors." Mason's expression sobered. "Jesus, where?" "South Trail, about 15 miles out. 7 dead. Looked like bandits." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Matheson gang, most likely. They've been hitting travelers all through that area." He looked more closely at the girls. "You poor little things. What are your names?" "I'm Emma," said one. "I'm Charlotte," said the other. Mason smiled kindly. "Well, Emma and Charlotte, you're safe now. Timber Creek takes care of its own." He glanced at Garrett. "You taking them to Doc Wilson?" Garrett nodded. "Thought he should check them over. Then we need to figure out their situation. They were headed to St. Louis to an aunt." "St. Louis is a mighty long way," Mason observed. "And the telegraph line's down again after that storm. Be at least a week before messages can get through." Garrett hadn't considered that complication. A week minimum before they could even begin inquiries about Margaret Thornton. "They can stay at the boarding house," Mason suggested. "Mrs. Elkins has room." To Garrett's surprise, Charlotte's hand suddenly gripped his wrist. "Can't we stay with you, Mr. Sullivan?" "Just until our aunt is found," Emma added quickly. Garrett stared down at them, momentarily speechless. Why would they want to stay with him? He was a stranger, and hardly a comforting presence. A brooding saloon owner who'd barely spoken 10 sentences to them. Mason raised an eyebrow, the ghost of a smile playing at his lips. "Well, Sullivan, seems you've made quite an impression." Garrett cleared his throat. "My place isn't set up for children." An understatement. The Frontier Star was a saloon first, his living quarters second. No proper beds for little girls, no toys or books or whatever else children needed. "We don't need much," Charlotte assured him earnestly. "Just a corner. We're very tidy." "And quiet," Emma added. "You won't even know we're there." Something in their expressions, that mixture of hope and resignation, as if they already expected rejection but couldn't help asking anyway, stirred something Garrett had thought long buried. A protectiveness, a purpose. "Just until we locate your aunt," he found himself saying. "Temporary arrangement." Twin smiles broke across their faces, the first he'd seen, transforming them from solemn little ghosts to actual children. For a moment, Garrett glimpsed who they might have been before tragedy struck. Bright, lively girls, with futures stretching before them. Sheriff Mason clapped him on the shoulder. "Well, look at that. Garrett Sullivan taking in strays. Never thought I'd see the day." "Temporary," Garrett repeated firmly, though he wasn't sure if he was reminding Mason or himself, as he helped the girls down from Scout, preparing to take them to Doc Wilson. Garrett couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stepped onto a path that would lead much further than he intended to go. Temporary arrangements had a way of becoming permanent. Connections, once formed, were hard to sever cleanly. He'd learned that lesson with Abigail, thought he'd never risk it again. Yet here he stood, with two small hands in his, two identical, faces looking up at him with cautious hope and a future suddenly far less empty than it had been yesterday. "Come on," he said gruffly. "Let's get you checked over. Then we'll sort out the rest." And so began what Garrett Sullivan would later recognize as both the end of his isolation and the beginning of an unexpected journey, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about family, belonging, and his own capacity for love. The first week passed in awkward uncertainty. Garrett had cleared out the storeroom behind the saloon's kitchen, a space once used for extra liquor and supplies, and transformed it into a makeshift bedroom. 2 narrow cots from the trading post, a small chest for their meager belongings, and a wash basin were all he could manage on short notice. The girls never complained. They moved through the saloon like quiet shadows, observing everything, touching nothing. During business hours, they remained upstairs in Garrett's quarters, reading the few books he owned, mostly about local flora and military history, hardly suitable for children, yet they devoured them anyway, sitting side by side, turning pages in unsettling unison. After hours they would emerge, helping to clean without being asked. Emma swept floors with methodical precision, while Charlotte wiped tables until they gleamed. They ate whatever Garrett prepared without comment, though he knew his cooking was rudimentary at best. They answered direct questions, but rarely initiated conversation. At night, Garrett often woke to check on them, a habit formed from that first evening. Sometimes he'd find them sleeping peacefully. Other times, they'd be awake, sitting up in their beds, whispering to each other in voices too low to comprehend. Once he discovered Charlotte silently weeping, while Emma stroked her hair with mechanical comfort, her own eyes dry but haunted. On the 8th day, Doc Wilson stopped by, ostensibly to check the twins' recovery, though Garrett suspected the town's curiosity was the true motivation. "They're physically healthy," Wilson confirmed as Garrett poured him a drink. The girls were upstairs, supposedly resting. Remarkable considering. No signs of illness or injury. "But," Garrett prompted, recognizing the doctor's hesitation. Wilson sighed, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "But trauma leaves marks that aren't always visible, Sullivan. Those children witnessed horrors no one should see, let alone ones so young. That kind of experience changes a person. They're coping," Garrett said defensively. "They're surviving," Wilson corrected. "There's a difference." The doctor's words lingered after he left. That evening, watching the twins meticulously fold napkins for the next day's service, Garrett realized he needed to do more. Keeping them fed and sheltered wasn't enough. They needed something approaching normalcy, whatever that meant for 2 orphaned girls living above a saloon. "Have you attended school before?" he asked during supper. The twins looked up from their stew, surprised by the unprompted question. "Yes," Emma answered, "in Kansas City, before our parents died." "Our mother taught us at home sometimes too," Charlotte added. "She was a teacher before she married Papa." Garrett nodded, encouraged by this longer response. "Timber Creek has a school. 1 room, all ages. Miss Abernathy teaches. Strict but fair, from what I hear." The girls exchanged one of their silent glances. "Would we go there?" Charlotte asked carefully. "If you'd like," Garrett replied. "Education's important. Even though we're only staying temporarily?" Emma's question held no challenge, only genuine curiosity. Garrett hesitated. The telegram to St. Louis had finally been sent 3 days ago, inquiring about Margaret Thornton. Who knew how long a response might take, or what that response would be? "Knowledge is never wasted," he said finally, "no matter how long or short your stay." The next morning, Garrett walked the twins to the schoolhouse at the edge of town. They wore their blue dresses, now cleaned and mended by Mrs. Peterson, who'd taken it upon herself to provide some womanly assistance, despite Garrett's protests that they were managing fine. Miss Abernathy, a tall woman with steel-grey hair and surprisingly kind eyes, greeted them at the door. "Welcome to Timber Creek School," she said warmly, bending slightly to address the girls directly. "You must be Emma and Charlotte." They nodded in perfect unison, causing Miss Abernathy's eyebrows to rise slightly. "I'm Emma," said one, touching the small red ribbon Mrs. Peterson had tied into her braid, the only way to distinguish them at a glance. "I'm Charlotte," said the other, whose ribbon was blue. "Excellent," Miss Abernathy smiled. "We're delighted to have you join us. We have 23 students, ages 5 to 16. She turned to Garrett. "Mr. Sullivan, I'll see they're properly—" "Settled. School dismisses at 3 o'clock. Garrett nodded, suddenly feeling strangely reluctant to leave. The twins looked small, standing in the schoolhouse doorway, their identical faces composed but wary. "I'll be here at 3, he told them. As an afterthought, he added, "You'll do fine." It wasn't much as far as encouragement went. But Charlotte gave him a small smile, and Emma's shoulders relaxed slightly, progress of a sort. That day, the saloon seemed unusually quiet despite the regular flow of customers. Garrett found himself glancing at the clock more frequently than necessary, wondering how the girls were faring. Were the other children kind to them? Did they know their arithmetic? Were they afraid? At 2:45, he left his bartender, Wilson, in charge and walked to the schoolhouse, arriving exactly as the students began pouring out. The twins emerged last, side by side as always. Charlotte carried a slate with chalk markings, while Emma clutched a small book to her chest. "How was it?" Garrett asked as they fell into step beside him. "Miss Abernathy asked us to read aloud," Charlotte said. "She says we're very advanced for our age. Billy Jenkins tried to pull my hair," Emma added matter-of-factly. "So I stepped on his foot." Garrett's mouth twitched. "That's so?" "Miss Abernathy didn't see," Charlotte assured him hastily. Emma was very subtle. "He won't do it again," Emma said with quiet certainty. Garrett believed her. Beneath her delicate appearance, Emma had a steely quality that reminded him of veterans he'd known, soft-spoken men who never started fights but always decisively finished them. "What's that book?" he asked, nodding toward the volume Emma carried. "Miss Abernathy lent it to us," she said, offering it for his inspection. "The Swiss Family Robinson. Have you read it?" Garrett shook his head, taking the worn volume. "Can't say that I have." "It's about a family shipwrecked on an island," Charlotte explained. "They build a wonderful home in a tree and tame all sorts of animals. Miss Abernathy thought we'd enjoy it because the family stays together despite terrible circumstances," Emma added, with the directness that was becoming her hallmark. Garrett glanced down at her, struck by her perception. Sounds appropriate. That evening, after the saloon closed, he found the twins sitting on their beds, taking turns reading aloud from the borrowed book. They looked up when he appeared in the doorway. "Would you like to listen, Mr. Sullivan?" Charlotte offered. Something in her hopeful expression made refusal impossible. Garrett settled awkwardly onto the room's only chair, a three-legged stool that creaked under his weight. "I'm not much for stories," he warned them. "That's all right," Emma said pragmatically. "We'll explain anything you don't understand." For the next half-hour, the girls took turns reading, their young voices bringing to life adventures in faraway places. Garrett found himself drawn in despite his initial reluctance. When they finished the chapter, Charlotte looked at him expectantly. "Will you come listen again tomorrow night?" The question caught him off guard. "If you'd like," he said gruffly. "We would," Emma confirmed, as if settling a business arrangement. Thus began their nightly ritual. After the saloon closed and the floors were swept, Garrett would sit on the creaking stool while the twins read aloud from whatever book Miss Abernathy had loaned them. Sometimes they'd stop to discuss the story, the girls offering earnest interpretations while Garrett mainly listened. Occasionally, he'd share a relevant experience or piece of knowledge that would make their eyes widen with interest. Simple as it was, the routine provided structure, a small pocket of connection amidst the lingering awkwardness. Garrett began to recognize subtle differences between the twins beyond their ribbons. Emma's expressions changed less frequently, but more dramatically when they did. Charlotte blinked rapidly when thinking. Emma sat perfectly still when listening intently, while Charlotte often fidgeted with her hands. 2 weeks after they started school, Garrett was serving a customer when Sheriff Mason entered the saloon, his expression uncharacteristically serious. He waited until the patron had moved to a table before approaching the bar. "Got a reply from St. Louis," he said without preamble. Garrett's hand stilled on the glass he was wiping. "And?" "No Margaret Thornton at any address matching the description. The telegram office checked city records too. No woman by that name registered as living in St. Louis proper for the past 3 years. Could she have moved recently or married?" Mason shrugged. "Possible, but without more information, it's a dead end, Sullivan." Garrett absorbed this, his mind racing through implications. What about other Thorntons? "Several families listed, but without knowing which one might be related." Mason trailed off. "We could send more telegrams, I suppose. Ask each one if they're missing twin nieces. But that would take time and money, and might lead nowhere," Garrett thought. Or worse, might attract the wrong kind of attention. Whoever had attacked that wagon had been thorough, almost as if they'd been targeting the occupants specifically rather than just looking for valuables. "What do we do now?" Garrett asked, more to himself than to Mason. The sheriff leaned on. "The bar. Well, seems to me those girls need a guardian, someone to look after them proper, at least until more permanent arrangements can be made." "The Petersons," Garrett began, "are good folks with 5 children already and another on the way," Mason interrupted. "And Widow Jenkins took in her sister's boy last month. Town's bursting with children, Sullivan. Meanwhile, you've got space, means, and apparently their trust." Garrett frowned. "I run a saloon, Mason, hardly a suitable environment for young girls. And yet they're thriving under your roof. Doc Wilson says they're gaining weight. Miss Abernathy tells me they're the brightest students in her class. Even Mrs. Peterson admits you're doing a fair job, though she thinks the girls need more feminine influence." Mason's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Face it, Sullivan, you've become their guardian in all but name." Before Garrett could form a response, the saloon door opened and the twins entered, returning from school. They paused at the sight of Sheriff Mason, their expressions instantly guarded. "Afternoon, girls," Mason greeted them cheerfully. "How was school today?" "Educational," Emma replied seriously. Charlotte nudged her sister slightly. "It was fine. Sheriff Mason, thank you for asking." Their formality with everyone except Garrett had become notable around town. With him, they were beginning to show glimpses of ordinary childish behavior. Occasional giggles, small requests, even minor disagreements. With others, they maintained a polite but impenetrable distance. "I'll consider what you've said," Garrett told Mason quietly as the twins disappeared into the back room to change out of their school clothes. But no decisions today. That night, after their reading, Garrett broached the subject carefully. "Sheriff Mason received a telegram from St. Louis today." The twins immediately straightened, their expressions a mix of hope and apprehension. "They couldn't locate your Aunt Margaret," he continued gently. Charlotte's face fell, while Emma's became more closed. "What does that mean?" Charlotte asked after a moment. Garrett chose his words carefully. "It means we need to make some decisions about your situation. Temporary arrangements can't last forever." "You're sending us away," Emma stated flatly. "Not a question." "No," Garrett said, surprised by how quickly he rejected that notion. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Charlotte's voice trembled slightly. Garrett ran a hand through his hair, uncomfortable with the conversation, but knowing it couldn't be avoided. "I meant that we need to consider more official arrangements for your schooling, your future. You need a proper guardian." "Aren't you our guardian now?" Charlotte asked. "Informally, yes, but there are legal considerations." Emma's eyes narrowed slightly. Do you want to be our guardian? Officially? It was exactly the direct question Garrett had been avoiding asking himself. Did he want that responsibility? These children had been thrust upon him by circumstance. Taking them in temporarily, during an emergency, was one thing. Voluntarily assuming long-term responsibility for their welfare was something else entirely. It's not a simple yes or no, he hedged. Actually, it is, Emma countered with that unnerving adult perception. Either you want us or you don't. Charlotte placed a restraining hand on her sister's arm. What Emma means is, we'd like to stay with you, if that's all right. The simplicity of their desire, stated so plainly, caught Garrett off guard. These children, who had lost everything twice over, were asking to remain with him, a broken, grieving man who ran a saloon and barely spoke to most people. It made no sense. Why? He found himself asking. Why me? The Petersons have other children, a proper family home. The twins exchanged one of their glances. You don't expect us to be happy, Emma said finally. Garrett blinked. What? Everyone else wants us to smile and play and pretend everything is fine, Charlotte explained softly. But you understand that sometimes it's not fine. You give us space to be sad, Emma continued, but you don't treat us like we're broken. And you read with us, even though you say you don't like stories, Charlotte added with a small smile. Garrett stared at them. These two small, perceptive beings who had somehow seen through his gruff exterior to something he barely acknowledged. Himself, his respect for their grief, his recognition of their resilience. I'll speak to Judge Harmon next time he's in town, he said after a long moment, about making things official, temporary guardianship to start. Their smiles, Charlotte's wide and immediate, Emma's smaller but no less genuine, sparked. An unfamiliar warmth in his chest. Not happiness exactly, but something adjacent to it. A sense of purpose he hadn't felt since Abigail's death. The following day, Garrett made a decision. After closing the saloon early, he led the twins to the small general store. Pick out fabric, he instructed them, for new dresses and anything else you need. Their surprise was evident. Since arriving, they'd worn the same 3 dresses, washed and mended, but still showing wear. Are you sure? Charlotte asked hesitantly. It must be expensive. I'm sure, Garrett affirmed. A growing girl needs proper clothes. While they carefully examined bolts of fabric with the shopkeeper's wife, Garrett moved to another section, returning with 2 small items that he quickly paid for and pocketed. That evening after supper, he presented each girl with a small package, wrapped in brown paper. What's this? Emma asked, suspicious of unexpected gifts. Open it and see, Garrett replied. Inside each package was a journal, simple leather-bound books with blank pages. Charlotte's had a small embossed flower on the cover, Emma's a star. I thought you might like somewhere to write your own stories, Garrett explained awkwardly, or just thoughts, private ones. It was the most personal gift he could think to give them, acknowledgement of their separate identities, their need for individual expression beyond their twinned existence. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, but for once they seemed to be happy ones. Even Emma looked momentarily overcome. Thank you, Charlotte whispered, clutching the journal to her chest. Emma, less demonstrative, but no less affected, nodded firmly. We'll use them well. That night, Garrett heard them talking long after they should have been asleep. Not the usual whispers, but animated discussion, punctuated by occasional giggles. He didn't interrupt. Some spaces belonged to children alone, and he was learning when to intervene and when to step back. As he sat alone in the darkened saloon, nursing a single whiskey, Garrett reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a solitary man consumed by grief and bitter memory. Now he was purchasing fabric for dresses and considering legal guardianship of twin girls. Abigail would have been amused by the transformation. She'd always told him he had more capacity for care than he admitted. He'd dismissed her assessment as wifely bias. Now he wondered if perhaps she'd seen something in him that he hadn't recognized himself. The next morning, Garrett woke to an unusual sound, singing. Soft and slightly off-key, but unmistakably singing. He followed the sound to the kitchen, where he found Charlotte attempting to make biscuits while Emma set the table. Charlotte's voice faltered when she noticed him in the doorway. "Sorry if we woke you," she said. "You didn't," he assured her. "That song, where did you learn it?" "Our mother used to sing it," Emma answered, "when she baked bread on Saturdays." Another piece of their past, emerging slowly through the layers of trauma. Another glimpse of the children they'd been before tragedy struck. "It's nice," Garrett said simply. "You should sing it more often." The smile Charlotte gave him was like sunshine breaking through clouds, bright, unexpected and warming. As they ate breakfast together, Emma said suddenly, "Mr. Sullivan, would it be all right if we called you something else?" Garrett looked up puzzled. "Like what?" The twins exchanged glances, clearly having discussed this already. "Guardian sounds very formal," Charlotte explained. "And uncle doesn't seem quite right, since you're not actually our uncle." "What did you have in mind?" Garrett asked cautiously. "Just Garrett," Emma suggested. "For now." For now. The implication of those words, that they were considering something more familiar in the future, hung in the air between them. "That would be acceptable," Garrett agreed, his tone serious, though something light flickered in his chest. "Thank you, Garrett," Charlotte said, testing the name with a smile. "Thank you, Garrett," Emma echoed more solemnly, but with equal sincerity. And, in that moment, awkward and imperfect as it was, something shifted between them. The tentative connection that had been forming thread by thread over the weeks suddenly felt more substantial. Not yet a rope strong enough to bind them permanently, but no longer the fragile filament it had once been. They were building something. Together, day by day, word by word, a family perhaps, or at least the beginnings of one. 2 years later, the piano arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by 3 sweating men who cursed its weight all the way up the saloon steps. Garrett directed them to place it against the far wall, where natural light from the windows would fall upon the keys during daytime hours. He paid them handsomely for their trouble, ignoring their curious glances. It wasn't new. A second-hand upright from Denver, with a few scratches on its mahogany finish and one slightly yellowed key. But it had been tuned recently, and the seller had assured him it had many good years left. Garrett ran his fingers over the smooth wood, remembering Abigail at their old piano. She'd played beautifully, filling their home with sonatas and ballads that seemed to rise from her very soul. After her death, he'd sold their piano along with most of their possessions. Couldn't bear the silence of the instrument without her there to bring it to life. Now here he was, bringing another piano into his life. Not for himself, but for Charlotte. "Is that—" The girl's voice came from the staircase, breathless with disbelief. Garrett turned to find the twins frozen mid-descent, their eyes wide. At 13, they were growing tall, their copper braids reaching past their shoulders, their faces beginning to lose the roundness of childhood. "Thought you might like to practice on something better than Mrs. Peterson's worn-out keyboard," Garrett said, trying to sound casual. Charlotte flew down the remaining stairs and across the room, her hands hovering over the piano as if afraid it might disappear at her touch. Emma followed more slowly, watching her sister with quiet pleasure. "It's beautiful," Charlotte whispered. "Can I—" "It's yours," Garrett replied. "That's the point." With reverent care, Charlotte settled onto the bench and positioned her fingers. The first notes were tentative, but soon she was playing a simple melody she'd been practicing for weeks. The sound filled the saloon, imperfect but spirited, much like Charlotte herself. Emma moved to stand beside Garrett, her arms folded across her chest in her characteristic posture. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. Garrett glanced down at her. "I wanted to." "She's been dreaming about having a piano again since Kansas City." Emma's voice held no jealousy, only appreciation. "She used to practice for hours on our mother's piano." Garrett nodded. Over the past 2 years, small details of the twins' previous life had emerged gradually. Their father's law practice, their mother's love of music and literature, the spacious home they'd lived in before the cholera epidemic took both parents. Within days of each other. "What about you?" he asked. "Any instruments you miss playing?" Emma shook her head. "I was never musical like Charlotte. I preferred my father's books." She hesitated, then added, "Though I did enjoy riding, father had a chestnut mare he sometimes let me take out." It was the first time she'd expressed interest in an activity from her past life. Garrett filed the information away, mind already, turning over possibilities. Charlotte played for nearly an hour, growing more confident with each piece. When she finally stopped, her cheeks were flushed with happiness. "Thank you," she said simply, but her eyes conveyed deeper gratitude than words could express. "The saloon could use some proper music," Garrett replied gruffly. "Been too quiet. For too long." That evening, as customers filled the Frontier Star, many paused to admire the new addition. None were more appreciative than Doc Wilson, who requested a song after his second whiskey. Charlotte obliged with a simple rendition of Beautiful Dreamer that brought conversation to a momentary halt. When she finished, applause erupted. Charlotte blushed furiously, but smiled. From her corner table where she was completing arithmetic. "Assignments," Emma watched with quiet pride. "Those girls are turning this place civilized, Sullivan," Sheriff Mason commented, leaning against the bar. "Next thing we know, you'll be hosting tea parties." Garrett snorted, but there was no real annoyance behind it. The truth was, the twins had changed the Frontier Star in countless subtle ways. Freshly laundered curtains now hung in the windows. Wildflowers appeared in jars on tables during spring and summer. The floors were swept twice daily instead of once. Even the clientele had shifted slightly. Fewer rowdy cowhands, more townspeople, and respectable travelers. "They've changed you too," Mason added more quietly. "For the better." Garrett didn't respond, but he couldn't deny the truth of the observation. The consuming grief that had once defined his existence had gradually receded, not vanished, but transformed into something more bearable. The girls had given him purpose when he'd lost all sense of it, had pulled him back into the world when he'd been content to fade from it. 2 months after the piano's arrival, Garrett led Emma to the small stable behind the saloon. She followed with curiosity, having been told only that he needed her opinion on something. When they entered, Emma stopped short at the sight of the dappled grey filly in the end stall, her intelligent eyes watching them cautiously over the half-door. "What?" Emma began, her usual composure slipping. "Trader from Wyoming. Territory came through yesterday," Garrett explained. "Said she's half Morgan, half something wild. Spirited but trainable for the right person." Emma approached the stall slowly, extending her hand palm up. The filly stretched her neck, nostrils flaring as she caught Emma's scent. "She's beautiful," Emma whispered. "She needs a firm hand, someone patient but determined. Made me think of you." Emma turned to look at him, eyes wide with disbelief. "She's for me," Garrett nodded. "If you want her, she'll need training, daily attention. It's a commitment. I want her," Emma said without hesitation, more emotion in her voice than Garrett had heard in years. "What will you call her?" Emma considered the filly thoughtfully. "Athena, for the goddess of wisdom and strategy." A fitting name, Garrett thought. Emma had been devouring books on Greek mythology lately, particularly drawn to tales of clever Athena and her tactical brilliance. "Good choice," he said. "We'll start training tomorrow." The following months brought new routines. Mornings now included Emma's work with Athena, guided by Garrett's experience and occasional advice from the town's blacksmith, who'd once been a cavalry horse trainer. Charlotte's piano practice filled the afternoons, her skills improving with remarkable speed under the tutelage of Mrs. Belmont, a former concert pianist who'd retired to Timber Creek with her merchant husband. The twins were flourishing. Charlotte's natural warmth had begun to re-emerge, drawing people to her like moths to flame. She charmed customers with her music and conversation, remembered everyone's names and stories, and showed genuine interest in the lives of those around her. Miss Abernathy had even suggested she might consider teaching someday. Emma remained, more reserved, but had developed close friendships with a select few, including the blacksmith's son and Judge Harmon's bookish daughter. Her intelligence had become legendary in town. At 14, she could calculate complex figures faster than most grown men, debate philosophical questions with the town's educated elite, and had read every book in Miss Abernathy's considerable library. In their different ways, both girls were becoming integral parts of Timber Creek, no longer viewed as those poor orphans, but as Charlotte and Emma Sullivan, the talented pianist and the brilliant horsewoman. The saloon owner's girls. Legally, Garrett's temporary guardianship had become permanent a year earlier, when Judge Harmon had finally given up on locating any blood relatives and granted Garrett full guardianship rights. The twins had chosen to keep the Sullivan name, a decision that had affected Garrett more deeply than he'd admitted. On a crisp autumn afternoon, as golden light bathed the town in warmth, Garrett sat outside the saloon, watching Emma put Athena through her paces in the small corral they'd built together. The filly, now nearly a full-grown mare, responded to Emma's slightest commands with alert precision. "She's got a natural seat," observed Ben Wheeler, the blacksmith, who'd stopped to admire the display. "Rides like she was born to it." "She's dedicated," Garrett replied. "Works with that horse every day, rain or shine." Wheeler nodded appreciatively. "My Jacob says she's the smartest person he's ever met. Says she could run a bank or a railroad if women were allowed such things." Garrett's mouth quirked in a half-smile. She probably could and would. As Emma guided Athena in a perfect figure. 8. Charlotte emerged from the saloon carrying a tray with coffee and slices of freshly baked apple cake. She'd taken to baking recently, experimenting with recipes collected from women around town. "Thought you might like an afternoon treat," she said, setting the tray on the small table between Garrett and Wheeler. "You're spoiling us, Miss Charlotte," Wheeler said, helping himself to a generous slice. "My wife says I've gained 10 pounds since you started baking." Charlotte laughed, the sound as warm as the autumn light. "Then I'll have to send some home for her too, so she can't complain." Garrett watched her easy interaction with the blacksmith, marveling again at how naturally she connected with people. Charlotte remembered that Mrs. Wheeler had a fondness for cinnamon, that the blacksmith preferred his coffee black with 2 sugars, that their youngest daughter was recovering from measles. She stored away such details effortlessly, using them to make others feel valued and seen. As Wheeler departed with a wrapped slice of cake for his wife, Charlotte settled into the chair beside Garrett, watching her sister with pride. "She's magnificent, isn't she?" Charlotte said softly. "Not just her riding, everything about her, the way her mind works, how she sees connections others miss." Garrett nodded. "You both are, in different ways." Charlotte glanced at him, surprise flickering across her features. Though Garrett had grown more demonstrative over the years, open praise remained rare. "Mrs. Belmont says I could study at a conservatory someday," she said after a moment. "If I wanted to. She has connections in Boston. Is that what you want?" Charlotte considered the question. "I'm not sure. I love music, but I also love it here, the saloon, the town, the people." She paused. "Our family." The word hung in the air between them, simple yet profound. Family, not by blood, not by law, but by choice and circumstance and countless shared moments. Whatever you decide, Garrett said carefully, Boston isn't going anywhere. There's time. Charlotte smiled, understanding the message beneath his measured words. You have a home here, always. Later that evening, after the saloon closed, Garrett found himself alone downstairs, completing the nightly ledger entries. The twins had retired. Early, tired from a day of riding and piano lessons and school, the doors were locked, the windows shuttered against the autumn chill, when a sharp knock sounded. Frowning, Garrett moved to the side window and peered out. Sheriff Mason stood on the porch, his expression grave. Beside him was a stranger, a tall man with military bearing despite his civilian clothes, his face partially obscured by shadow. Garrett unlocked the door, but didn't open it fully. A bit late for social calls, Mason. This isn't social, the sheriff replied grimly. This is Lieutenant James Thornton, recently promoted to captain, cavalry officer out of Fort Laramie. The stranger stepped forward into the lamplight, revealing a handsome face with distinctive green-gray eyes startlingly familiar. Mr. Sullivan, the man said, his voice cultivated but strained with emotion. I believe you have custody of my nieces. Garrett's blood ran cold. Your nieces? Twin girls, Emma and Charlotte Thornton, orphaned when my brother Robert and his wife Elizabeth died of cholera in Kansas City. Last seen in the company of my cousin James Whitaker, who was transporting them to my sister Margaret's home in St. Louis. Each detail landed like a physical blow, the pieces aligned too perfectly to be a coincidence. I've been searching for them for 5 years, Thornton continued, following every lead, investigating every report of twin girls along the western trails. Last month, a former patient of Doc Wilson's mentioned remarkable twin girls living with a saloon owner in Timber Creek. Garrett's mind raced. The timing made sense. A drummer who'd passed through last month had taken ill, been treated by Doc Wilson, then continued on to Fort Laramie. I have documentation, Thornton said, producing a leather portfolio. Birth certificates, death certificates for their parents, letters from my brother entrusting their care to me should anything happen to him and his wife. Sheriff Mason looked deeply uncomfortable. I thought you should see this tonight, Sullivan, before he approaches the girls. Wanted to give you warning. Warning. As if advance notice could soften the blow of what this meant. Garrett's grip tightened on the doorframe. The girls are asleep, he said flatly. They have school tomorrow. I understand, Thornton replied, though tension radiated from his ramrod-straight posture. I've waited 5 years. I can wait until morning. He hesitated, then added with barely controlled emotion, Are they, well, healthy, happy? The naked hope and fear in the man's voice caught Garrett off guard. This wasn't some cold official looking to enforce legal technicalities. This was a man who had spent years searching for family he'd thought lost forever. They're thriving, Garrett admitted reluctantly. Top of their class, talented, strong. Relief washed over Thornton's features. Thank God, and thank you for caring for them all this time. His voice broke slightly. I never stopped looking, never gave up hope. Sheriff Mason cleared his throat. Captain Thornton is staying at the hotel. He'll come by in the morning. After breakfast, Garrett nodded stiffly. Good night, then. As he closed and locked the door, his mind churned with implications. The twins had family, real family, blood family. A military officer with documentation, means, and clear devotion to their welfare. What judge would deny his claim? More importantly, what right did Garrett have to stand between the girls and their uncle? He had no biological connection, no legal standing that would supersede blood relations. He was merely the man who had found them, cared for them, grown to love them as his own. Merely, as if the bonds formed over 5 years could be so easily dismissed. Garrett poured himself a whiskey with unsteady hands and sat heavily at one of the tables. What would he tell the girls? How would they react? Emma's hard-won trust, Charlotte's fragile happiness, how would this news affect them? And selfishly, terribly, his own heart clenched at the thought of the emptiness their absence would create. The saloon without Charlotte's music or Emma's precise arrangements, mornings without their voices, evenings without their stories and questions and small discoveries. He drained the whiskey and poured another, remembering the day he'd found them hiding in that bullet-riddled wagon. Two traumatized children with nothing and no one. Now they were accomplished young women with a future full of promise and family, coming to reclaim them. Perhaps this was always how it would end. Perhaps he'd simply been a temporary guardian in truth, despite what the legal papers said. A way station on their journey back to where they truly belonged. The thought brought a pain so acute it stole his breath. Garrett remained at the table deep into the night, wrestling with conflicting emotions. Grief at the prospect of losing. The girls, guilt at wishing to keep them from their rightful family. Fear of what this disruption might do to their hard-won stability. By dawn, he'd reached no resolution, only the heavy certainty that everything was about to change. He was frying bacon when Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair neatly braided, already dressed for school. Her eyes narrowed at the sight of him. "You didn't sleep," she observed. Not a question. Garrett didn't bother denying it. "We need to talk. You and Charlotte both, before school." Emma's posture stiffened immediately. 5 years had tempered her wariness, but it had never entirely disappeared. "What's happened?" "Let's wait for your sister." Charlotte appeared moments later, yawning slightly. Her smile faded as she registered the tension in the kitchen. "What's wrong?" she asked, looking from Emma's alert stance to Garrett's grim expression. Garrett gestured for them to sit. When they were settled at the small kitchen table, he took a deep breath. "A man arrived in town last night. Captain James Thornton, stationed at Fort Laramie." He paused, watching understanding dawn in Emma's eyes before he even continued. "He claims to be your uncle, your father's brother." Charlotte gasped softly. Emma's face went completely still. "He has documentation," Garrett continued, forcing. The words passed the tightness in his throat. "Birth certificates, letters from your father. He says he's been searching for you since the attack." 5 years, Emma said flatly. Garrett nodded. "He says you were meant to go to your Aunt Margaret in St. Louis, Margaret Thornton, his sister." Charlotte's brow furrowed. "But when you sent telegrams—" "She'd moved from St. Louis by then," Garrett explained. According to Captain Thornton, the twins exchanged one of their silent glances, a habit that had never disappeared despite their growing individuality. "He's coming here to see us?" Charlotte asked, her voice small. "This morning, after breakfast." Emma's hands clenched into fists on the table. "And then what? He takes us away, just like that?" The naked fear in her voice pierced Garrett's heart. "I don't know," he admitted. "He has a legal claim as your blood relative, but nothing will happen immediately. There would be processes, legal proceedings." "But we're Sullivans now," Charlotte protested. "You're our guardian. It's official." "Blood relations generally take precedence," Garrett said carefully, "in the eyes of the law." "The law?" Emma spat the word like a curse. "The law didn't find us hiding in that wagon. The law didn't give us a home when we had nothing. You did." Her fierce loyalty should have warmed him. Instead, it only deepened his anguish. These girls had already lost so much. Now they faced another upheaval, another severing of the connections they'd formed. "I want you to listen to me," Garrett said, leaning forward. "Both of you. Whatever happens, this is your home, always, no matter what any judge or law says. Do you understand?" Charlotte nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Emma remained stone-faced, but her chin trembled slightly. "He'll be here soon," Garrett continued gently. "You don't have to go to school today if you don't want to." "I want to meet him," Emma said suddenly, her voice hard. "I want to see this. Uncle, who took 5 years to find us." Charlotte placed a hand on her sister's arm. "Emma, he might not have known where to look. The wagon train was attacked. Everyone died except us." "Exactly," Emma retorted. "Everyone died. And where was Uncle James then? Not looking for survivors, apparently." Before either Charlotte or Garrett could respond, a knock sounded at the saloons. "Front door. All three froze. The half-eaten breakfast forgotten." "That'll be him," Garrett said softly. Emma stood, shoulders squared as if preparing for battle. Charlotte rose more slowly, unconsciously moving closer to her sister. Garrett looked at them, these girls who had become the center of his world, who had brought light back into his life when he'd thought all light extinguished, who were about to face yet another turning point in their young lives. "Ready?" he asked. The twins nodded in unison, an echo of their earlier years when they moved and thought as one. Despite everything, despite their growing independence and distinct personalities, in moments of crisis, they still turned to each other first. "We're ready," Charlotte said. "We're Sullivans," Emma added firmly, "no matter what he says." With those words fortifying him, Garrett moved to answer the door, the twins following several paces behind. Whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced everything since that bloody day 5 years ago. Together, Captain James Thornton stood framed in the doorway of the Frontier Star, sunlight casting his tall figure in sharp relief. At 40, he cut an impressive figure, broad-shouldered and straight-backed in a well-tailored suit with the unmistakable bearing of a military man. His hair was the same copper shade as the twins, though streaked with premature silver at the temples. And his eyes, those distinctive green-gray eyes, moved past Garrett to fix on the girls with naked emotion. "Emma," he breathed. "Charlotte." The twins remained frozen several paces behind Garrett, their expressions guarded. In the harsh morning light, the resemblance between them and the captain was undeniable. The same high cheekbones, the same straight nose, the same distinctive coloring. "How do you know which is which?" Emma challenged, her voice tight with suspicion. A fleeting smile crossed Thornton's face. Emma always stood slightly ahead of Charlotte, even as toddlers. Protective instinct. His voice softened with memory. "And Charlotte always had a small mole near her left ear. Does she still?" Charlotte's hand unconsciously moved to the spot, a tiny birthmark usually hidden by her hair. "May I come in?" Thornton asked, addressing Garrett directly. Garrett stepped aside wordlessly, allowing the captain to enter. Sheriff Mason followed, his discomfort evident in his shifting gaze and fidgeting hands. Thornton moved into the saloon with measured steps, as if afraid any sudden movement might cause the girls to flee. His eyes never left them, drinking in their features with a mixture of joy and disbelief. "You've grown so much," he said quietly. "The last time I saw you was at your 6th birthday celebration. You wore matching blue dresses with white pinafores. Our mother made those," Charlotte said, speaking for the first time. "She embroidered daisies on the collars." Thornton nodded eagerly. "Yes, exactly. Elizabeth was always so skilled with a needle. She embroidered handkerchiefs for all the men in the family every Christmas." The casual mention of their mother's name and habits landed like a physical blow. Here was someone who had known their parents intimately, who shared memories of a life the twins had begun to forget, despite their efforts to hold on to every detail. "Please, may we sit?" Thornton gestured to the nearest table. "There's so much to say, so many years to account for." Garrett looked at the twins, letting them decide. After a moment, Charlotte nodded slightly. Emma's jaw remained tight, but she moved toward the table with reluctant steps. For the next hour, Captain Thornton spoke of the family the twins had lost, their father's law practice, their mother's devotion to charity work, holiday gatherings at the Thornton family estate in Virginia. He described the frantic search after receiving news of the wagon attack, the false leads and disappointed hopes, the conviction that they must have survived despite all evidence to the contrary. I requested transfer to every Western outpost. Impossible, he explained. Fort Laramie was my 7th posting in 5 years. Every leave, every spare moment, I continued searching, asking questions in every settlement, showing your miniatures to anyone who would look. From his breast pocket, he withdrew 2 small painted portraits, the twins at age 6, solemn-faced in their formal clothes, their copper braids nearly identical to how they wore them now. Your father had these commissioned for my sister Margaret, just before he fell ill, Thornton explained. I've carried them across 8 territories and 3 states. Charlotte reached out hesitantly, touching the edge of her portrait. We don't have any pictures, she said softly. Nothing from before. You do now, Thornton said gently. These are yours, along with everything else I've preserved from your parents' home. Throughout this exchange, Garrett remained standing, near the bar, listening silently. The evidence was overwhelming. Every detail Thornton provided aligned perfectly with the fragments the twins had shared over the years. This was no imposter or fortune seeker. This was their blood uncle, who had spent 5 years searching for them with devotion few men would maintain. The realization settled in Garrett's chest like a stone. What happens now? Emma asked bluntly, giving voice to the question hanging in the air. Thornton seemed taken aback by her directness. Well, I had hoped. He gathered himself. I've purchased land outside Boston. A proper estate with gardens and stables, the kind of home suitable for my brother's daughters. There are excellent schools nearby, opportunities for music and riding, and all the accomplishments young ladies of your background should acquire. Boston, Charlotte echoed, her face paling. I've been stationed there since my promotion, Thornton explained. It's a civilized city with every advantage, nothing like... His eyes swept the saloon, taking in the worn floorboards and simple furnishings. Nothing like what you've become accustomed to. Emma's spine stiffened. We're quite comfortable with what we've become accustomed to, Captain Thornton. The formal address, the pointed refusal to call him uncle, did not escape the captain's notice. His expression faltered briefly before he composed himself. Of course you are. Mr. Sullivan has clearly provided admirably under difficult circumstances. He turned to Garrett with apparent sincerity. I cannot express my gratitude adequately, sir. Knowing my nieces were in caring hands all this time, it eases a burden I've carried for years. Garrett acknowledged the thanks with a slight nod, his face betraying nothing of the turmoil beneath. But surely, Thornton continued, turning back to the twins, you must have wondered about your family, about the life that was meant to be yours, the education, the society, the future your parents envisioned. We have a life here, Emma countered. Friends, school, responsibilities. And Garrett, Charlotte added quietly but firmly. A shadow passed over Thornton's features, not anger, but a complicated mixture of sympathy and determination. I understand this is sudden, he said carefully. I don't expect you to simply pack your belongings and leave everything you've known for 5 years. There will be time for adjustment, for proper goodbyes. Goodbyes. Charlotte's voice wobbled slightly. Sheriff Mason, who had been silent throughout the exchange, cleared his throat uncomfortably. Perhaps we should all take some time to consider. It matters. The girls have had quite a shock, Captain, and Mr. Sullivan as well. Of course, Thornton agreed immediately. Forgive my eagerness. It's just, I've imagined this moment for so long. His eyes returned to the twins with naked longing. You're all that remains of my brother, the last of our branch of the Thornton family. The nakedness of his emotion was difficult to dismiss. Whatever his faults, Captain Thornton's love for his nieces appeared genuine. I'm staying at the hotel for the week, he said, rising from his chair. Perhaps we could meet again tomorrow, or whenever you feel ready. I have so many questions about your lives these past years. The twins looked to Garrett, a habit so ingrained they didn't realize they were doing it, seeking his guidance, his permission. The simple gesture tightened Garrett's throat with emotion. "We'll send word," he said, speaking for the first time. Since introductions, Thornton seemed to register something in Garrett's tone, a subtle assertion of authority, of place in the girls' lives. His jaw tightened momentarily before he nodded with military precision. "Very well. Thank you for your time today." He reached into his jacket and produced a small package wrapped in fine paper. A small token, nothing elaborate, just something I thought you might like to have. He placed it on the table, then moved toward the door with Sheriff Mason. At the threshold, he turned one last time. "I've waited 5 years," he said quietly. "I can wait a little longer." As the door closed behind them, the silence in the saloon seemed to vibrate with tension. Charlotte stared at the package on the table. Emma remained rigid, her eyes fixed on the door as if expecting the captain to return. Garrett watched them both, uncertain what to say or do in the face of this seismic disruption. Finally, Charlotte reached for the package, carefully unwrapping it. Inside lay a silver-frame photograph of a handsome couple, the man bearing a striking resemblance to Captain Thornton, but with a gentler countenance, the woman fair and delicate, with Charlotte's sweet smile. "Our parents," Charlotte whispered, tracing the glass with trembling fingers. Emma leaned forward, her composure cracking slightly at the sight of the faces they had struggled to remember clearly for years. "They look so young," she murmured. "I'd forgotten how young they were." Garrett moved closer, looking over their shoulders at the photograph. Robert and Elizabeth Thornton gazed back with solemn dignity, unaware of the tragedy that would befall them, of the long separation and unlikely reunion of their family. "He seems sincere," Charlotte ventured after a long moment. "Of course he does," Emma replied sharply. "He wants to take us away." "Emma," Charlotte began. "No." Emma stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. 5 years, Charlotte, 5 years. Where was he when we were hiding in that wagon? Where was he when we had nightmares every night? Where was he when we were building a life here? "Searching for us, apparently," Charlotte said gently. "All over. The Western Territories." "Convenient," Emma scoffed, though her voice wavered slightly. "And now he just appears and expects us to leave everything, to leave Garrett and Timber Creek and Athena." Her voice broke on the mare's name. Garrett's heart twisted. Emma's attachment to the horse he'd given her was profound. Athena represented not just freedom and responsibility, but the first real gift she'd received in her new life. "No one's leaving yet," Garrett said, finding his voice at last. "Nothing's been decided." Both girls turned to him, their expressions nakedly vulnerable, in a way he hadn't seen since those early days after the wagon attack. "We don't want to go," Charlotte said, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "You know that, don't you?" "This is our home," Emma added fiercely. "You're our family, not some stranger with the same color hair." Garrett pulled out a chair and sat heavily. "It's not that. Simple, girls. Captain Thornton is your blood relation. He has documents proving it, and he clearly cares for you deeply." "So do you," Charlotte countered. "And I'm not going to Boston," Emma declared, crossing her arms. "I don't care what any judge says." Garrett ran a hand through his hair, the familiar gesture betraying his agitation. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. We need to think clearly about this." He looked at them directly. "What Captain Thornton is offering, education, opportunities, society, these are advantages I can't provide. A future more in line with your parents' expectations." "Our parents are dead," Emma said bluntly, "along with their expectations." "Emma," Charlotte gasped. "Well, it's true." Emma's voice was harsh with emotion. "And I'm tired of people using them to manipulate us. Uncle James, Captain Thornton, whoever he is, doesn't know us, not anymore. He knows 2 6-year-old girls from Virginia who no longer exist. The raw truth of her statement hung in the air. They had changed irrevocably. The traumatized children Garrett had found in that wagon had grown into young women with distinct personalities, talents, and dreams, all shaped by their life in Timber Creek, not by their aristocratic Virginia roots. "You should talk with him." "Again," Garrett said finally. "Get to know him better before making judgments." "Will you be there?" Charlotte asked, a note of plea in her voice. "If you want me to be." "We do," both girls said in unison, their voices overlapping as they rarely did anymore. Garrett nodded, a plan forming. "I'll invite him to dinner tomorrow evening. Here, not at the hotel. On our territory." He glanced at Charlotte. "Maybe you could play the piano for him." Charlotte's brow furrowed. "You want me to perform for him? Like a trained monkey?" "No," Garrett corrected gently. "I want him to see who you are now, what you've become, not just his memory of a 6-year-old in a pinafore." Understanding dawned in Charlotte's eyes. "You want him to know us as we are." "It seems only fair," Garrett agreed, "before any decisions are made." Emma's tension eased slightly. "And if he still wants to take us to Boston afterward?" Garrett met her gaze steadily. "Then we'll face that challenge when it comes, together." The word hung between them, a promise and a reminder of all they'd weathered as a family, not by blood, but by choice and circumstance and years of shared life. That afternoon, Garrett closed the saloon early and walked to the hotel. He found Captain Thornton in the small dining room, writing in a leather-bound journal. "Mr. Sullivan," Thornton said, rising, "I didn't expect to see you so soon." "The girls would like to see you again tomorrow evening," Garrett said without preamble. "Dinner at the Frontier Star, 7 o'clock. Surprise and pleasure crossed Thornton's face. "I would be honored." "Understand something?" Garrett continued, his voice low and measured. "Those girls have been through more than most adults could endure. They've rebuilt their lives from nothing, twice. I won't see them uprooted again without their consent." Thornton's expression hardened slightly. "With all due respect, Mr. Sullivan, they are my nieces, my blood. While I appreciate everything you've done for them, truly I do, some matters transcend temporary arrangements. There's nothing temporary about 5 years of raising children," Garrett countered. "Nothing temporary about teaching them to ride, or listening to their nightmares, or watching them grow into themselves." The two men stared at each other, the unspoken challenge clear between them. Neither was willing to concede ground where the twins were concerned. "I think," Thornton said carefully, "we both want what's best for Emma and Charlotte." "The difference is," Garrett replied, "I know what that is. You're still guessing based on memories of toddlers." Before Thornton could respond, Garrett continued, "Dinner, 7 o'clock, the girls will expect you." He turned and left without waiting for acknowledgement, tension radiating from his shoulders as he strode back toward the saloon. At the schoolhouse, Emma and Charlotte sat through their lessons in unusual silence. Normally active participants, they responded only when directly addressed by Miss Abernathy. Their classmates noticed the change, exchanging curious glances and whispered questions. During the midday recess, they retreated to their usual spot. Beneath a large oak tree, isolated from the games and chatter of their peers. "He looks like Papa," Charlotte said suddenly, "especially around the eyes." Emma nodded reluctantly. "I was thinking the same thing." "Do you remember how Papa used to read to us every night, even when he was tired from work?" Charlotte's voice was wistful. "Captain Thornton has the same precise way of speaking." "That doesn't make him family," Emma countered. "Not really." Charlotte plucked at the grass beside her. "But he is family, Emma, by blood, and he's been searching for us all these years." "So has half the cavalry, according to him," Emma said skeptically. "Convenient that he's the one who found us. just as we're old enough to be proper young ladies for his Boston society. Charlotte frowned. You think he's lying? I think it's suspicious that he appears now, with talk of estates and schools rather than 5 years ago when we had nothing. That's not fair. He explained about searching all this time. Emma's face softened at her sister's distress. I know. I don't want to leave, Charlotte. I don't want to start over again. I don't want to leave Garrett. The naked vulnerability in Emma's voice, so rare from the more stoic twin, brought tears to Charlotte's eyes. She reached for her sister's hand. Neither do I, she whispered. But what if we don't have a choice? What if the law says we have to go with Captain Thornton? Then we'll find a way back, Emma said with sudden intensity. We're 13 now, not helpless children. If they force us to go to Boston, we'll save every penny until we can return to Timber Creek. Charlotte squeezed her hand. Promise? Promise. When school dismissed, they found Garrett waiting for them as usual, but today Sheriff Mason was with him, his expression grave. Girls, he greeted them, mind if I walk with you a bit? They exchanged worried glances but nodded as they moved down the dusty street toward the saloon. Mason cleared his throat. I wanted to speak with you about Captain Thornton and the situation. You mean how he wants to take us away? Emma said bluntly. Mason winced. It's complicated, Emma. In the eyes of the law, blood relations have certain rights, especially when they can provide advantages that... He broke off, glancing apologetically at Garrett. That Garrett can't, Charlotte finished quietly. Financial advantages, Mason clarified, educational opportunities and such. The judge considers these things when determining custody. The judge already determined custody, Emma argued. 2 years ago. Garrett is our legal guardian. That decision was made with the understanding that no blood relatives could be located, Mason explained gently. The circumstances have changed. They walked in silence for several paces, the weight of this reality settling over them. What if we refuse to go? Charlotte asked finally. What if we run away? Mason's expression grew troubled. That would make things very difficult for everyone, especially for Garrett. What do you mean? Emma demanded. If you were to run away rather than comply with a legal custody decision? Well, some might believe Garrett had encouraged such an action. Mason chose his words carefully. They might accuse him of kidnapping, Garrett supplied flatly. The twins stopped walking, identical expressions of horror crossing their faces. That's ridiculous, Emma exclaimed. Garrett would never... I know that, Mason assured her. But the law doesn't always see nuance, Emma. It sees a blood relative with legal claim versus a guardian who might have reason to resist giving up children he's raised. So we have no choice, Charlotte said, her voice hollow. Either we go willingly to Boston or Garrett suffers. Let's not borrow trouble, Mason said quickly. No judge has made any ruling yet. Captain Thornton hasn't even formally petitioned for custody. I'm simply preparing you for possibilities. But the damage was done. The twins' faces had closed off, Charlotte's drawn with worry, Emma's tight with anger. They resumed walking, in silence, the weight of impossible choices hanging over them. At the saloon entrance, Mason took his leave with an apologetic nod to Garrett. Inside, Emma immediately headed for the stables, seeking comfort in Athena's presence. Charlotte moved to her piano, fingers running soundlessly over the keys, as if afraid to break the heavy silence. Garrett watched them both, the familiar ache in his chest intensifying. He'd always known in some corner of his mind that this life they'd built together might be temporary, that the past might someday reclaim these girls who had become his reason for living. But knowing it and facing it were vastly different things. That night, after the twins had retired to their rooms, Garrett sat alone in the darkened saloon, staring at the amber liquid in his glass. He hadn't taken a single sip. His mind was too occupied with contingencies, with desperate plans and painful acceptance. "What would you do, Abigail?" he whispered to the ghost of his wife. "If they were ours by blood, and someone tried to take them, how far would you go?" The silence offered no answers, only the echo of his own conflicted heart. Tomorrow Captain Thornton would dine with them, would see the life the twins had built, the people they'd become, would perhaps understand what he was asking them to give up. And if he didn't, if he insisted on claiming his blood rights? Garrett's hand tightened on the glass. Some battles couldn't be won. Some losses couldn't be prevented. He'd learned that harsh truth when Abigail slipped away, despite every prayer and promise and medical intervention. But some battles, the ones that mattered most, had to be fought anyway, even against impossible odds. Even if fighting meant losing, everything else, the Frontier Star, had never looked so welcoming. Charlotte had spent the afternoon arranging wildflowers in tin cans, polishing glasses until they sparkled, and setting the best table with the mismatched china they reserved for special occasions. Emma had reluctantly helped, though her contributions were more practical, ensuring the stove maintained perfect heat, tenderizing the venison steaks Garrett had traded for that morning, checking that the bread rose properly. Garrett himself had closed the saloon for the evening, an unprecedented decision that had raised eyebrows among the regular patrons. This dinner with Captain Thornton was too important for the distractions of business, too crucial to their future. At precisely 7 o'clock, a knock sounded. Charlotte smoothed her best dress, a blue calico with lace collar that Mrs. Peterson had helped her make for last Christmas, and glanced anxiously at Garrett. "Ready?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tension evident in his shoulders. The twins nodded in unison. Emma's jaw was set in the determined line that signaled her emotional armor was firmly in place. Charlotte's hands fidgeted with her braid, betraying her nervousness despite her composed expression. Garrett opened the door to find Captain Thornton standing straight-backed on the porch, dressed in his formal uniform rather than the civilian clothes he'd worn previously. The brass buttons gleamed in the evening light, medals displayed prominently. On his chest, in his hands, he carried a small valise and a bouquet of store-bought flowers, luxuries rarely seen in Timber Creek. "Good evening," he greeted them, handing the flowers to Charlotte with a small bow. "Thank you for the invitation." "Welcome, Captain," Garrett replied formally, stepping aside to allow him entry. The saloon's main room had been transformed for the occasion. The long bar was polished to a shine, glasses arranged in perfect rows behind it. Tables had been pushed aside to create an intimate dining area centered around the piano. Lanterns cast a warm glow over everything, softening the worn edges of the Frontier establishment. "You have a lovely home," Thornton said, his eyes taking in the space with genuine interest. Emma's posture relaxed slightly at his acknowledgement. This wasn't just a saloon, it was their home, filled with 5 years of memories and small improvements. The curtains Charlotte had sewn, the bookshelf Garrett had built to house Emma's growing collection, the painting of wild horses a traveling artist had traded for a week's lodging. "Thank you," Charlotte replied, arranging the gifted flowers in a jar. "We've made it our own, bit by bit." Dinner began with an awkward formality that gradually eased as the meal progressed. Thornton proved to be an engaging conversationalist, sharing stories of his military travels that captured even Emma's reluctant interest. He spoke of desert landscapes where stars seemed close enough to touch, of mountain passes where eagles soared at eye level, of coastal forts where whales breached just beyond the harbor. "You've seen so much of the country," Charlotte marveled as she served the apple pie she'd baked that afternoon. "My search for you took me to places I never imagined visiting," Thornton replied, his voice softening. "Every new posting was another opportunity to extend the search perimeter." "How did you know we were still alive?" Emma asked directly. "After the attack, I mean, when no survivors were reported." Thornton set down his fork, his expression growing solemn. I didn't know for certain, but I couldn't accept the alternative. He hesitated, then continued more quietly. When I arrived at the scene, weeks after it happened, I noticed something the initial investigators had overlooked. Two sets of small footprints leading away from the wagon. They disappeared after a few yards, obliterated by horse tracks. But they existed, which meant at least two people had walked away alive. Garrett looked up sharply. "You found the site yourself?" Thornton nodded. "After receiving word about the attack, I obtained emergency leave from my posting in Kansas. By the time I arrived, nature had reclaimed most of the evidence, but I searched anyway." His voice grew tight with emotion. "I buried what remained of my cousin James and the others, said words over them, promised I wouldn't rest until I found out what happened to you both." The raw grief in his voice silenced any doubts about his sincerity. This was a man who had indeed been searching for 5 years, who had never abandoned hope that his nieces might have survived. "When I didn't find you in the immediate area, I reasoned someone must have taken you in. A passing traveler, perhaps, or a nearby settlement." Thornton looked directly at Garrett. "I never imagined you'd be raised by a man who found you hiding in the wreckage." "Garrett saved us," Charlotte said simply. "In every way, a person can be saved." Thornton's expression softened. "I believe that. And I'm more grateful than I can express." He turned to Garrett with genuine respect. "You did what I couldn't, Mr. Sullivan. You gave them safety, stability, a home. I will never forget that." The acknowledgement hung in the air between the men, a momentary bridge across the chasm of their opposing interests. After dinner, Charlotte moved to the piano at Garrett's subtle nod. Her fingers hovered over the keys briefly before launching into a complex piece she'd been practicing for months. The music filled the room, confident, nuanced, expressing emotions she couldn't put into words. Thornton watched with visible amazement, his eyes bright with pride and perhaps a touch of grief for all the moments he'd missed. "Elizabeth played," he said softly to Garrett. "Their mother, not as well as Charlotte, but with the same expression, the same feeling." When the piece ended, Thornton applauded enthusiastically. "Remarkable, truly. You have extraordinary talent, Charlotte." She blushed slightly. "Mrs. Belmont says I still rush the adagio sections." "Mrs. Belmont must be an exacting teacher indeed," Thornton smiled. "In Boston you could study with conservatory instructors, perhaps even perform in proper concert venues someday." The mention of Boston cast a pall over the warmth that had been building. Emma's posture stiffened once more, and Charlotte's smile faded. "About Boston," Emma began, her voice carefully controlled. "We appreciate your offer, Captain Thornton, but we've discussed it, and we don't wish to leave Timber Creek." Thornton's expression fell. "I understand this is your home now, but surely you must see that your futures would be brighter in Boston. The educational opportunities alone." "We're receiving an excellent education here," Emma countered. "Miss Abernathy is a graduate of Oberlin College. She's teaching Charlotte advanced music theory and me higher mathematics and Latin." "And there's more to education than books," Charlotte added softly. "Garrett has taught us about nature, about animals, about building and repairing, about keeping your word and helping neighbors without being asked." Thornton glanced at Garrett, whose face remained carefully neutral. "I don't doubt Mr. Sullivan's positive influence, but you are Thornton's. Your father, your parents, had certain expectations for your upbringing, for your futures." "Our parents would want us to be happy," Charlotte said. "With people who love us," Emma added pointedly. Thornton flinched slightly. "I love you both. You're all the family I have left in this world." The naked emotion in his voice was difficult to dismiss. Despite her resistance, Emma felt a flicker of sympathy for this man who had spent years searching for them, who carried their childhood, portraits over thousands of miles, who spoke of their parents with such intimate knowledge. "Perhaps," Garrett said carefully, breaking his long silence. "There's a middle path to consider." All eyes turned to him with surprise. "A middle path?" Thornton repeated, brow furrowed. "The girls have established lives here," Garrett continued. "Friends, responsibilities, pursuits they value. Uprooting them completely seems unnecessary. But I recognize your claim as their uncle, your desire to know them, to be part of their lives." "What are you suggesting?" Thornton asked warily. Garrett met his gaze directly. "Stay in Timber Creek. Not permanently, if your duties require you elsewhere, but long enough to truly know who Emma and Charlotte have become, to build a relationship based on who they are now, not memories of who they were at 6. Thornton blinked in surprise. "Stay here? In this town?" "Timber Creek has grown considerably in recent years," Garrett said evenly. "The railroad connection has brought new commerce, new people. It's not Boston, but it's not the wilderness either." "And what of their education? Their futures as young ladies of society?" "Miss Abernathy continues teaching them advanced subjects. And Emma mentioned, for other accomplishments, arrangements could be made. Visiting instructors, perhaps." Thornton frowned, clearly considering the proposal. "And where would I stay during this transition period?" "The hotel initially," Garrett replied. "If you decided to remain longer, there are several houses available for purchase or lease, or land if you preferred to build." The twins exchanged startled glances. This suggestion had never been discussed between them. This compromise that might allow them to maintain their life in Timber Creek while acknowledging their blood connection to Captain Thornton. "What about your military duties?" Emma asked. "You said you're stationed in Boston." Thornton hesitated. "My current posting ends in 3 months. I had planned to request an extension, but—" He straightened slightly. "After 15 years of service, I have considerable influence in requesting my next assignment. There are military installations within reasonable distance of this territory." Hope flickered across Charlotte's face. "So you could stay? Get to know us here, in our home?" "It's possible," Thornton conceded, though uncertainty lingered in his expression. "But eventual relocation might still be necessary. My career—" "With respect, Captain," Garrett interrupted quietly, "your career has been dedicated to finding these girls for 5 years. Now that you've found them, perhaps your priorities might shift accordingly." The challenge was subtle, but unmistakable. If Thornton truly cared for his niece's welfare above all else, he would adapt his plans to their needs rather than insisting they conform to his. Thornton studied Garrett with newfound appreciation. "You're not what I expected, Mr. Sullivan." "How so?" "I expected resistance, hostility even, not compromise." Garrett's expression remained measured. "My only concern is their well-being, their happiness. If that means sharing their lives with their blood uncle, so be it." His voice hardened slightly. "But I won't see them forced into a life they don't want, away from the home they've made." The unspoken warning was clear. Garrett might be offering compromise now, but he would fight if pushed. "I see." Thornton turned to the twins, who had been watching this exchange with tense attention. "What do you think of Mr. Sullivan's proposal? Would you be willing to get to know me better, here in Timber Creek?" "Yes," Charlotte said immediately, relief evident in her voice. "I'd like that very much." Emma hesitated, studying Thornton. With her characteristic intensity, "You wouldn't try to take us to Boston, not unless we decided we wanted to go." "You have my word," Thornton replied solemnly. "No forced relocation, though I hope you might consider visiting someday, even if you choose not to live there." Emma nodded slowly. "Then yes, I'm willing to try." Something eased in the room, a tension that had been building since Thornton's arrival the previous day. Not completely resolved, but transformed into something more manageable. a way forward that acknowledged all claims without sacrificing what mattered most. After Captain Thornton departed for the hotel, promising to return for breakfast the following day, the three Sullivans sat in contemplative silence around the dying embers of the cooking fire. "That was clever," Emma said finally. "Your compromise." Garrett shrugged slightly. "Not clever, necessary." "Do you really think it will work?" Charlotte asked, her expression hopeful but uncertain. "Him staying here instead of taking us away?" "And think," Garrett said carefully, "that he truly loves you, and that love will guide him toward the right decisions, given time and perspective." "Like it guided you," Emma observed quietly. Garrett's throat tightened unexpectedly. "I suppose so." Charlotte reached across the table to take his hand. "Thank you for fighting for us, but finding a way that doesn't force anyone to lose everything." "That's what family does," Garrett replied simply. The word hung in the air between them, family with all its complexity and obligation and fierce devotion. The following weeks brought remarkable changes to their lives. Captain Thornton took a room at the hotel, but spent most days at the Frontier Star, gradually integrating himself into the rhythm of their daily existence. He observed Charlotte's piano lessons with Mrs. Belmont, offering occasional insights from his own musical education. He accompanied Emma on rides, his cavalry horsemanship earning even her reluctant respect. He attended school functions and town meetings, introducing himself simply as the girl's uncle, without pressing claims of primary guardianship. For their part, the twins cautiously opened their lives to him. Charlotte shared the journal she'd been keeping for years, filled with poetry and observations about Timber Creek. Emma demonstrated Athena's training progress, pride evident in her typically reserved demeanor. Together, they showed him their favorite places, the ridge overlooking the valley, the small creek where they gathered wildflowers in spring, the schoolhouse where Miss Abernathy had nurtured their talents. Most importantly, they shared stories of their life with Garrett, the early days after the wagon attack, the gradual building of trust, the countless small moments that had transformed three wounded souls into a family. And Thornton listened, not with the impatience of a man enduring a delay to his plans, but with the genuine interest of someone trying to understand what he had nearly disrupted. 1 month after his arrival, Captain Thornton purchased land on the outskirts of town. 10 acres with a small cabin that could be expanded. He spoke casually of improvements he might make, of creating separate rooms for the girls, should they wish to visit or stay over occasionally. "You're really staying," Emma observed one afternoon, as they stood on his newly acquired property. Her tone held neither approval nor disapproval, merely verification of fact. "I'm really staying," Thornton confirmed, "at least until my next posting is determined. And even then," he hesitated, then continued more carefully, "even then this will remain my permanent residence, a home base, if you will." Emma studied him with her characteristic intensity. "Because of us. Because of you," he agreed simply. "You and Charlotte are all that matters now." For the first time, Emma's reserve cracked slightly. "You've given up a lot to find us, and now you're giving up more to stay." Thornton shook his head. "I'm not giving up anything that matters, Emma. A posting in Boston, society connections, these are poor substitutes for family." He looked toward the town, where the roof of the Frontier Star was visible in the distance. "Sullivan taught me that, though I doubt he intended the lesson," a ghost of a smile touched Emma's lips, "Garrett has a way of teaching without trying." "You love him very much," Thornton observed quietly. "Both of you." Emma tensed, wary of where this might lead. "Yes." "As you should," Thornton continued surprisingly. "He saved you when no one else could, raised you when it would have been easier, to place you with a conventional family, created a home when his own heart was broken. These are not small things, Emma." Relief and confusion mingled in her expression. "You're not jealous? Or angry?" Thornton considered the question seriously. "I was, at first, jealous of the years he had with you that I lost. Angry that another man had assumed the role I considered rightfully mine. But then I saw you together, you and Charlotte with Sullivan, the way you move around each other, anticipating needs without words being spoken, the absolute trust in your interactions." He shook his head slightly. "That's not something that can be manufactured or transferred. It's earned, day by day, crisis by crisis." "Like you're earning it now," Emma said softly. "Day by day." Thornton's eyes widened slightly at this unexpected acknowledgement. "I'm trying. No!" Emma hesitated, then added, "And so does Charlotte. She's already halfway to adoring you." "And you?" Emma's mouth quivered with a rare smile. "I'm more cautious than Charlotte, always have been." "Fair enough," Thornton chuckled. "I'll keep trying." Back at the Frontier Star, Garrett was replacing a loose floorboard when Sheriff Mason entered through the side door. His expression was grave enough to make Garrett set down his hammer and straighten. "Problem?" Mason glanced around. "Girls not here?" "With Thornton at his new property." "Why?" Mason relaxed slightly. "Telegram came. From Fort Laramie. Thought you should see it before Thornton does." He handed over a folded paper. "It's his reassignment orders, effective next month." Garrett scanned the telegram, his heart sinking as he read. "Fort McHenry, Maryland, East Coast," Mason confirmed grimly. "About as far from Timber Creek as military postings get." Garrett refolded the telegram, his mind racing with implications. Thornton had promised not to force the twins to relocate, but military orders weren't optional. Would he resign his commission to keep that promise? Or would the pull of duty and career prove stronger than his developing relationship with his nieces? "I'll make sure he gets this," Garrett said finally. Mason hesitated. "You've all seemed to be adjusting, finding a balance. This could upset everything." "Or clarify it," Garrett replied. "One way or another, we'll know where we stand." After Mason departed, Garrett sat heavily at the bar, the telegram like a physical weight in his pocket. The past month had brought unexpected changes to their lives. Despite his initial suspicions, Garrett had found himself reluctantly respecting Thornton. The captain was honorable, intelligent, and genuinely devoted to the twins' welfare. He'd made real efforts to understand their lives in Timber Creek, rather than simply imposing his vision of what their futures should be. More surprisingly, Garrett had observed the twins gradually opening themselves to their uncle. Charlotte's natural warmth had blossomed in response to Thornton's sincere interest in her music. Even Emma, far more guarded, had begun sharing her thoughts on books and philosophy with him, engaging in debates that stretched long into evening hours. A family was forming, not the one Garrett had built over 5 years, nor the one Thornton had envisioned, but something new, something that encompassed both men's claim on the twins' hearts, while prioritizing what the girls themselves wanted and needed. And now, these orders threatened to shatter that delicate new balance. Garrett was still sitting there when the twins returned, cheeks flushed from the autumn air, eyes bright with the day's adventures. Charlotte immediately noticed his unusual stillness. "What's wrong?" she asked, her intuition as sharp as ever. Garrett considered deflecting, but discarded the impulse. They deserved honesty, especially now. "Captain Thornton has received new orders," he said, producing the telegram. "Fort McHenry, Maryland." The color drained from Charlotte's face. Emma's expression hardened into the mask she wore when bracing for pain. "When?" Emma asked flatly. "He's to report next month." Charlotte sat heavily in the nearest chair. "But he promised. He promised he wouldn't make us leave." "Military orders aren't requests," Garrett explained gently. "He's a career officer. This isn't something he can simply refuse." "Then what happens to us?" Charlotte's voice trembled. "What happens to everything we've built here?" Before Garrett could respond, the saloon door opened and Thornton himself entered. He stopped short at the tableau before him. Charlotte's distress, Emma's rigid posture, Garrett's solemn expression. "What's happened?" he asked sharply. Wordlessly, Garrett handed him the telegram. Thornton scanned it, his face paling slightly as he read. "I see," he said quietly. "Mason works quickly." "Uncle James," Charlotte began, her voice small. "Does this mean—" Thornton looked at each of them in turn, his expression unreadable. Then with deliberate movements, he removed his uniform jacket and laid it carefully across a chair. Without the insignia and brass buttons, he seemed somehow more human, less the embodiment of military authority. "Do you know why I joined the Cavalry?" he asked unexpectedly. The twins shook their heads, confusion mingling with their distress. "My father, your grandfather, expected it. 3 generations of Thornton men had served. It wasn't a choice so much as an assumption." He smiled, faintly. "Your father was the rebel, the first to choose a different path, law instead of military service. He faced considerable disapproval from our father, but he stood firm." Thornton moved to the window, looking out at Timber Creek's main street as he continued. "I've served 15 years, seen 9 territories and 4 foreign countries, risen through the ranks exactly as expected." He turned back to face them. "And not once in all those years did I question whether it was the right path for me. Not until now." "What are you saying?" Emma asked cautiously. "I'm saying that my priorities have changed. Finding you both, seeing the remarkable young women you're becoming, has altered everything." He straightened, decision evident in his posture. "I'll be submitting my resignation from military service, effective immediately." Garrett stared at him in disbelief. "You're leaving the cavalry? After 15 years? "A career is just a career," Thornton said simply. "Family is something else entirely." He looked directly at the twins. "I made you a promise. No forced relocation. I intend to keep that promise, military orders notwithstanding." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. "But your position, your pension, are meaningless compared to what I've found here," Thornton finished for her. "I have means beyond my military. Salary. The Thornton family estate in Virginia provides income, and I've invested wisely over the years." He smiled slightly. "I won't be reduced to poverty, I assure you." The enormity of this decision stunned them all into momentary silence. Captain James Thornton, career military officer, dedicated soldier, was willing to sacrifice his lifelong profession to honor a promise made to the nieces he'd only just found. "You don't have to do this," Garrett said finally. "Yes, I do," Thornton replied with quiet certainty. "For the same reason you offered compromise instead of conflict when I first arrived, because their well-being matters more than anything else. The recognition of shared values, of a common devotion that transcended blood or legal claims, passed between the men like a current. For the first time they saw each other not as rivals for the twins' affection, but as allies in ensuring their happiness and security." Emma moved first, crossing the room to stand before her uncle. Without a word, she extended her hand formally, as if sealing a business arrangement. Thornton took it, his expression solemn. "Thank you," she said simply. Charlotte joined them, less restrained in her reaction. She threw her arms around Thornton in a swift embrace that he returned with visible emotion. "We'll make it work," she promised. "All of us together." Garrett watched this tableau with complicated feelings. Relief that the twins wouldn't face another. Upheaval. Respect for Thornton's willingness to sacrifice his career for their sake. And something else. A recognition that family could be more flexible, more encompassing than he'd ever imagined. Not just the family he and the twins had forged through trauma and recovery and daily commitment. Not just the blood connection Thornton represented, but something new, something that honored both claims while placing the girls' needs at the center. "We should celebrate," Charlotte declared, wiping away tears. "A special dinner, all of us together." "And invite some others," Emma suggested unexpectedly. "Sheriff Mason, Miss Abernathy, Doc Wilson, people who have been part of our lives here. A proper family gathering." Thornton agreed, smiling at their enthusiasm. The word family hung in the air, no longer a point of contention but a description of what they were becoming. Something unconventional, unexpected, but no less real for its unusual formation. That evening, as lanterns glowed in the frontier star and conversation flowed around the tables they'd pushed together, Garrett found himself standing slightly apart, watching. Charlotte played the piano while Miss Abernathy turned pages. Emma engaged Doc Wilson and Thornton in animated debate about a new medical treatment. Sheriff Mason regaled Mrs. Peterson with an exaggerated tale of his deputy's latest mishap. Community, a family, not defined by blood or law, but by choice and circumstance and shared history. Thornton approached, offering Garrett a glass of the fine whiskey he'd contributed to the celebration. "They're remarkable," he said quietly, following Garrett's gaze to the twins. "A testament to your influence." "And their own resilience," Garrett countered. "They survived the unimaginable. Twice. They won't have to survive a third upheaval." Thornton promised. "Not while either of us has breath to prevent it." The alliance implicit in those words, the shared commitment to the twins' welfare above all else, settled something in Garrett's chest that had been tight since Thornton's arrival. "To family," Thornton said, raising his glass. "However it forms," Garrett clinked his glass against the captain's. "To my family." Across the room, the twins looked up simultaneously, as if sensing the significance of the moment. They're identical. Faces broke into smiles, Charlotte's open and joyful, Emma's smaller but no less genuine. In that moment, watching the girls who had saved him as surely as he had saved them, Garrett knew with absolute certainty that they would be all right. All of them, together, not as he had once imagined, not as Thornton had planned, but in a new configuration that honored all connections, those forged by blood and those created through love and time and daily devotion. A family formed not once, but many times over, through loss and discovery, through compromise and commitment, through the courage to hold on and the wisdom to let go, through the recognition that love, in its purest form, always finds a way forward. Up next, you've got two more standout stories. Right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.